Today, I'm looking at a basic editing workflow in Affinity Photo 2 for those landscape photographers coming from the Lightroom and Photoshop world of Adobe. Why even look at Affinity Photo 2? Well, Adobe's has seen a fair bit of drama around their Terms of Service update back towards the end of May, and then some legal challenges around their cancellation policy for subscriptions. This in turn has led to even more people looking at alternatives to Adobe products for photo editing. I even did a video on the Terms of Service update topic with my thoughts on that I'll link to down in the description below. And while I don't think it was a big deal, I understand other people do, and that's why we're looking at alternative software. So while there are several alternative products out there, Serif, the makers of Affinity Photo 2, have been quite aggressive with their attempt to win over some customers. First, it was a 50% off sale, which is how I finally broke down and picked up Affinity Photo 2. But then they announced a 6-month free trial of their software, which is a pretty great opportunity to try something different. That's plenty of time to give it a spin. In addition, as a person that leads workshops and has lots of exposure to the photography community, I often get asked questions about photo editing software, sometimes specifically about alternatives to Adobe, either because of pricing or the subscription model, or someone simply looking for something else. So while I'm pretty happy with Adobe products, I thought a deeper dive in Affinity Photo 2 was warranted. I've spent the past several weeks consuming tutorials online, working with some old photos of mine, some new photos of mine, all in Affinity Photo 2 to get more practice and become more familiar with the software. I thought it'd be helpful to talk through some of the Affinity Photo 2 basics in the context of how one might have done things in the Adobe ecosystem workflow. Photoshop, Lightroom, things like that. Now, I'm not going to dive in any advanced concepts of this video, mainly highlight a few key components of Affinity Photo 2, how it fits into your workflow, and how I am working with a raw file from start to finish. This video is assuming that you've done work in Adobe land to some extent, and you know what certain equivalent tools are and what they do. But I do intend to cover some more specific how do I topics with Affinity Photo 2 in the future to help landscape photographers learn more about this software. So if I talk about something that you aren't sure about, do me a favor, drop a comment below, and I'll consider it for a future video on Affinity Photo. With that, let's dive in, take a closer look at Affinity Photo 2. Okay, so we've got Affinity Photo 2 open here on the computer, and before we dive in, I just want to sort of just talk a little bit about the interface. I have a raw file open here, and what I want to talk about first is what Affinity calls personas. Think of personas as sort of like modules. It's sort of like a develop module, a photo module, and some others. So those are accessible here at the top. Because I have a raw file open, we are in the develop module. This is going to be very similar to your Adobe Camera Raw, or what you might do, some of the basics you might do in Lightroom to get things going. You also have the photo persona over here at the top, and this is where you're going to do a lot of the Photoshop-like things. This is where you're going to do curves, layers, levels, and you can do gradients, and you can do luminosity masking and everything like that. That's where we're going to do a lot of the heavy lifting on this particular file. But at the top, you also have a liquefy persona, so you can sort of push and shove things around. We're not going to really cover that in this video. Got the develop persona, which is what we're in here. This is your raw editing software. This is where you sort of whip the file into shape. Got the tone mapping persona, which we're not going to touch on here for this particular video. And then your export persona, so that when you're done editing the photo, you can export it out of Affinity Photo 2 for sharing. So we're going to start with focusing on the develop persona in Affinity Photo 2. This is where your raw file is going to come into. Now you can access this raw file either by finding it on your file system, right-clicking on it and choosing open in Affinity Photo 2. You can come up here to file, go to open, and then right here, I've got my photo. It's a DSC 7766. It's a Nikon raw photo file taken earlier this week down in Hocking Hills, one of my favorites. It's a waterfall. It was raining. A thunderstorm was actively passing through when I took this particular photo. But what we've got our tools over here on the left, but most of the lifting that I do and have been doing so far with the raw file is over here on the right. And this is where we got our basic camera raw type adjustments that we can make. And what I aim to do here is just sort of whip this file into shape so I can do more work to it underneath the photo persona. So for example, if we look here, the histogram, it's a little off to the left. So I want to brighten things up a little bit. I want to start off with the raw file. So I'm going to use the exposure slider, just sort of bring things over a little bit, brighten it up a bit. Things are really dark in the corners. So I'm going to bring the black point down a little bit. You can see I can make a big swing, lightens things up a lot. I just want to take a little bit of the edge off there. Contrast, I'm going to leave alone, not really going to play with it. If you felt like it was too contrasty though, you could sort of bring it down. If you felt like you're oversaturated, you got your saturation settings here, you got your vibrance settings. Next, we've got white balance, and you'll notice it's not checked. So if I come in here and make big swings with this white balance slider, nothing happens. And that's because this module's not active. So I have to check off that. And now obviously this is way too cool. So it started out something around here. In fact, if I double click on it, similar to Adobe, similar to Photoshop, it'll reset it back to what it was when it came out of the camera. So in this particular case, I think it's a little too warm. So I'm going to just bring that white balance down a little bit, just a little bit, right in something like right around there. Now, I photograph in this particular area a lot, and I know things tend to get skewed to the green side because of the rocks and because of all the trees. So usually I know I'll need to add a little bit of magenta. So what I do is I sort of do a bigger swing until it's like obviously now there's too much magenta. Then I back it off just a little bit until I find about the right spot. And about 10% is good. So again, what I'm doing here is I'm fixing the basics. This is stuff I would normally do in either Lightroom to get the file whipped into shape or Adobe Camera Raw or something like that. I'm doing these basic global settings to try to essentially flatten this file out so I have lots of room to play more in the photo persona, or if I was in Adobe land, in Photoshop. Another little trick of white balance, if you want, there is a white balance tool over here. It's over here on the left. Shortcut commands, sometimes they vary a little bit, but I can hit W on the keyboard or click the icon over here for white balance. And if I do that, I can tap on and it's going to auto set. So it's like sort of like the automatic white balance picker that you have in Adobe Lightroom or Camera Raw if you're trying to figure it out and trying to get an idea of where it should be. This one's pretty close, but again, I'm going to warm it up just a teeny bit, fix that. Once you're done with that, you can press H to get back to the hand, essentially, but it's the one that you can sort of move and move the photo and things like that. So H is a handy keyboard shortcut to know, or you can just click the hand over here. So that's white balance. Come down to shadows and highlights. I feel like I flattened this file out pretty good. I might bring these shadows up a little bit. Again, notice nothing changed, and that's because I forgot to check off the shadows and highlights. So I feel like when I go in there and anytime I move that, because I'm used to Adobe, it's going to change. But I have to enable the module and then I can make the changes. So keep an eye on that. If you're making a slider change, you're like, I'm not seeing any difference, make sure you've got the module activated with the checkbox. So those are the basics. I sort of flattened this file out. I feel pretty good about that. So we go over here to lens. Over here in lens, you have your normal lens corrections. So I have lens correction checked. It knows I shot it with a Nikon 24-120. I'm not really making any adjustments here. On a super wide lens, sometimes you can scale this back, get a little bit more of your image in there if you want to play with this setting. As you can see, if I do it here, I start to get the edges of the frame in there distorted. So this one doesn't need touched with, 100% is good. And then chromatic aberration reduction, this is always good to have checked off just to get any kind of weird fringing taken care of. I just have it set to use lens profile from there. So that's really all I do in the develop persona in Affinity Photo 2. My goal, just sort of flatten the file out, fix any kind of tone contrast type issues so that when I go into the photo persona, I'm feeling pretty good about it. Now, one of the things with Affinity Photo 2 is your output. So up here at the top, you can see I'm set to raw layer linked. Well, by default, it's set to pixel layer. Now, pixel layer, there's three ways when I go into the photo module about what's going to happen with this file. If you go with the default pixel layer, it's essentially going to take a snapshot of all the work I just did here and pull that into the photo persona, the photo module, and I won't be able to go back and make any changes. So if I decide I messed up white balance or tint, which I do frequently, and I want to go back and fix it, if I choose pixel layer, I can't. So to me, the better options are you can do a raw layer embedded. And what this is going to do, it's going to pull the raw file over and pull it into the Affinity Photo file, the working file, so that when you save it, that file is going to be much bigger because it has an embedded copy of the raw file. Or you can do raw layer linked, which is just going to link to the raw file, and that'll keep my Affinity Photo file, the one where I'm doing all my edits and work in, much smaller. Now, I've been working as raw layer linked for most of my recent edits, but as I start to build up more files, more pieces and parts, I feel like those are going to get separated, which will make things not work if I'm linked. Because if you're linked, you need to keep it with the Affinity Photo 2 file. So I think I might switch over to embedded. It's going to cause my Affinity Photo files to be much larger, but I feel like everything's going to be in my Affinity Photo file. So if I'm organizing things, keeping things, I'll have what I need and not risk losing those two. We'll see how it goes. For this demo, we're doing link. So let's demonstrate that. So we've got this here. We're going to go over the photo persona. It's going to say commit. So we're going to go ahead and commit those changes. And now I am in the photo persona. And this is the tool that's much more like Photoshop than it is like Lightroom. So if you're comfortable in Photoshop, the change over to Affinity Photo 2 is probably going to come a little easier to you than it would be if you do the majority of your work in Lightroom. And I think that's one of the important points here is it isn't so much that Affinity Photo 2 makes editing easy or anything like that. You still have to understand the tools and know how you want to approach editing a file. So if you struggle in some of the Adobe products from just a standpoint of mastering editing, you still sort of need those concepts to be successful in Affinity Photo 2. It's not a magic button, it's just a different way, different software to do things that you're able to do in Photoshop. So first thing I want to demonstrate though is before we dive into the photo persona is to play with that raw file and show you what I mean. So say I'm in here and I hate this white balance and I'm not happy. Because I'm raw linked, I can drop back to the photo persona. Let's use white balance as my sample. Let's just really crank this thing up to an ugly, way too warm. So I've changed the raw file. We're gonna pop back over to photo, let it commit the changes. And as you can see, I fixed the white, well, in this case, not fixed. I broke the white balance in my photo persona as well. I'm able to go back to that raw file and fix it. That's why you want to do raw, either embedded or linked as opposed to pixel. Let's jump back over there. I don't want that white balance, obviously. That is terrible. We're going to bring this back down about where I was, just right about there. Fixed it. We'll pop back into the photo persona here at the top. Again, raw linked file, I've fixed my white balance again. So a super handy tool there that you can do your edits, and if you want to go fix your raw file for some reason, you can. So let's show you around real quick here in the photo persona. Again, very similar to Photoshop. You've got your toolbars over here on the left. You've got things like your cropping tools. You've got gradient tools down here. You've got healing, dodging tools. You've got text tools. You've got warping tools, healing tools. Pretty much all the tools you would be used to having in Photoshop are here in Affinity Photo 2. They're all here on the left. You can customize how this looks. You can do rows of tools and do a single row. For here, I'm pretty much close to the default, and we're sitting right there. Over here on the right side of the screen, very similar to Photoshop, you've got your histogram up here at the top. You've got your layers piece, channels, brushes. They include a stock tab. You can hide this, but layers is where we're going to be spending most of our time. And then down here, we've got our common buttons. We've got our mask layer. We've got our adjustment layers. We've got our layer effects, and we've got our live filters. So this is where Affinity Photo 2 sort of really shines, whereas some of the things we might have used panels for, like for luminosity masking and things like that, Affinity Photo 2 has that built right into the software, so we can add that, and we will see some of those as I demonstrate through here. So again, these are the buttons down here. These are also available up here in the menu, so you've got the layer, and you can do new adjustment layers. You can do all those up here. You can do the live filter layers. These are new mask layers. These are all similar options to what you have down here. I tend not to use the menu if I know where the command is down here, so I'm going to focus on the ones that are down here inside the studio over here on the lower right. Change your viewing size. Right now you can see the navigator. You can do this through keyboard shortcuts. Take it quickly to 100% by Command 1 or Control 1 on your, if you're a Windows, and then I can navigate all around the frame. And then if I'm done working on an area, so this is super handy for sharpening, from that standpoint. But then if I want to get right back so I can see the whole thing, Command 0, Control 0 will take you back to fitting the screen. So that's sort of the basics of the layouts. Again, very similar to Photoshop, not so similar to Lightroom. So again, I feel like this move to Affinity Photo 2 will be easier for heavy Photoshop users than it will be for Lightroom users, because a lot of the techniques I'm going to have to use here are more similar to Photoshop uses than Lightroom uses. Let's come in here with some basic editing. Again, I'm not going to do extensive editing on this photo. I'm just going to clean it up, show you a couple of the basics, and you can see how it works similar to Photoshop. First thing we're going to do an adjustment layer. I want to fix the levels. As you can see up here in the histogram, I've got a lot of room for more blacks and even a little bit for some highlights. So we're going to come in here, we're going to do levels to do that. I'm going to bring black level up like this. Again, this is adding a little bit of contrast, sort of giving me more contrast in the image, make it a little less flat. Raw files tend to be flat. I'm sort of fixing that. Now I did purposely set that to be sort of flat and raw because I wanted to use these tools to sort of really bring the photo to be what I wanted it to be. On the highlight side, not quite as much room, but we can bring the highlights down a bit and we look pretty good. So that's levels. That's just me trying to add a little bit of contrast. You can see just already we've gone from sort of flat, raw file, keeping things nice and even, do some level adjustments, and I get that extra bit of contrast in there. So next thing I want to do is I want to come in and I want to play with the curves layer, because what I want to do is I want to add a little more contrast in the midtones. So for that, I'm going to use a curves layer, which is down here underneath our adjustment. So our adjustment, scroll down, find curves. This gives you a very typical curves layer. Again, it's got the histogram sort of mapped out. We're going to put a point there, put a point there. We're going to bring the darks down a little bit more. Again, we're playing with contrast here. Just try to get those tones sorted out. Bring the highlights up here. Add a little bit of contrast and then just play a little bit with the black point. Bring it up a touch because I just like that look. So I've got that. So here's my whole curves layer, and it's affecting everything from shadows to the highlights. But I really just want to apply this to the midtones. So there's two ways to do this in Affinity Photo 2. I'm going to show you both real quick, but I'll tell you which one is my favorite. So first, you can just change this layer's blend mode, which is this little gear icon right here. You click the gear icon. And over here, what this is saying is I've got this line that's draggable. This is essentially everything's all white. So similar to masks, white reveals, black conceals. So right now it's letting that whole curves layer effect through. But if I only want to apply that to the midtones, I can bring this down. So this changes it essentially to black. It's concealing it. I can bring this up, put another point here, and bring this here. And what I've done is I've essentially, the bottom of this graph is black. So if a point is down here, the effect is not coming through. This is being applied to the curves layer. So those curves adjustments are not being applied at all on the darkest part of my image or the brightest part of my image. And then there's a gradual transition to the midtones. And then I can tweak what midtones do I want. If I want to back it off a little bit, I can change. So this is the blend option to do it. And it is pretty handy, but there's a couple things I don't like quite as much about it. And let me show you real quick. Let's go ahead and we're going to put that there. So let me show you what it did. So you can see it's a much more subtle contrast adjustment in those midtones. But I don't really like this way of doing it, but I wanted to show you it's there. So I'm going to delete that curves layer. We're going to add another curves layer underneath the adjustment. Scroll down the curves. Do the same thing. I'm going to put a point. I'm going to bring my darks down a little bit. Bring those brights up a little bit. Again, my goal here is I'm actually going to just apply to the midtone. So I'm not too worried that I'm up here getting a little brighter than I might want to be. That's okay with me. So that looks good. I do like to lift that black just a touch. It's just something I like to do. So we'll close that. Now, the way I prefer to fix this is through luminosity masks. And to do that, we have our masking piece right here, mask layer. If I just click that, it's just going to add a mask on there like normal, like we would in Photoshop. I don't want one of those. I want a luminosity mask, something you'd normally use a panel for, likely in Photoshop. So we're going to delete that mask. If I hold my Option key down and press mask layer, I can do a luminosity range mask. And I click that, and I get something that looks very similar to the blend. But one, it has drop downs. I can immediately just apply it to shadows, midtones, or highlights. I want this just to go to midtones, so I'm like, cool. And as you can see, it's very similar to that blend layer. It puts it right here. Now, why do I like this one better? Because it's got a handy dandy preview button, and it lets me preview where the changes are going. Again, white is letting the effect come through. It's letting those curves adjustments work. Black is not. So with this preview, I can tell there's a little more getting affected by this than I want. So I can fix that by just sort of dragging this guy, bring this guy up, and I can sort of tailor that to hit more of the midtones I want as opposed to as much of the image. So that's why I like this one. It gives me the preview. I can uncheck preview. I can see what it looks like. Save it. And you can see that's it. Now, in this particular case, as I see that and I flip back and forth, I think it's a touch too strong. So just like Photoshop, you can change. There it is with the mask on, mask off. I like 90%. I think that sits good. So again, the key point here is you have your adjustment layers. You can apply masks to it, and you actually have luminosity masking built into the software, which is super handy. And I especially like that you can choose shadows, midtones, highlights, which gets a lot of the work done for me, and I can make subtle adjustments using that preview button to make it work. Now let's do another fix here real quick. This water is way too bright in my opinion. I want the focus to be on the waterfall. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna put in an adjustment layer. I use brightness and contrast. This is affecting the whole image because I have no mask on it yet. I'm gonna bring the brightness down, and I'm really just mainly watching that water in the foreground. Bring that down about -35%. I'm gonna close that. You can see it's affecting the whole image, and I only want it to affect that bottom part. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna put a mask on here. So I click my mask button. So the mask comes in as white, and that means everything I did in that brightness is coming through. The mask is not hiding any of it. So what I want to do is I'm going to invert that mask. You can do that by pressing Command or Control I while you're on the mask layer, and it inverts that mask. So now it's black. As you can see, now none of that adjustment is coming through. The black is concealing it all. So then what I want to do is over here on our left, like I said, we've got a lot of the similar tools that we'd have in Photoshop, things like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over here and grab this linear gradient. We're going to drag it up from the bottom, and you can see sort of feather it up into here. And what I've done is I've taken this gradient and it's bringing white up and feathering it off. If I want to see what it looks like, I can right click and do edit mask. And you can see I'm just sort of feathering that up. And what that is doing is darkening that water for me. So now I'm going to look at my brightness contrast. And the only thing it's really affecting is the water down here in the bottom. Again, I'm trying to pull my eyes into the waterfall and away from that. So the other thing I want to do is I want to make these highlights just a little bit brighter up here towards the top. So what we're going to do is we're going to add another adjustment layer, brightness. We're going to bring the brightness up a little bit like that. The whole image is getting bright, but I know I'm going to apply a mask, so I'm cool with it. I'm going to come over here to the mask layer, hold Option, do a luminosity mask range. We're going to do highlights. As we can see, it's lit up these pieces and parts up here. Do a preview. Now things that are too bright, the water, and in this section up here, I really just wanted the part back here behind the bridge to be affected. But now I'm going to take a brush on this layer, hit B, or it's this over here on the left, and it's just like any mask in Photoshop. If I paint black on this, it's going to hide that effect. It's going to conceal it. So we're going to make this brush a little bigger, and we're just going to brush over the water because I don't want that boost to hit that. So we're just going to really paint over all of this. And I'm also going to paint over up here because that part was already pretty bright, and I don't really need it any brighter. And filter that in here, get it out of the edges, and come back into the mask. And we're going to toggle off, toggle on, and you can see back here behind the bridge, it gets just a little bit brighter. So the last little thing I want to do here is I just want to do a little bit of color grading here, just to make the highlights a little warmer, make the shadows a little cooler. So we're going to come back into our adjustments, come into our white balance. I'm going to warm up the white balance. I'm watching the highlights because that's what I want to change. So I'm just boosting that like by 5-6%. In fact, that's 6 is probably a touch too much. Don't want it to go too yellow. So I boost that. This is a white balance adjustment. Right now it's being applied to the whole image. We don't want that. I only want it to go to the highlights. So we're going to add a luminosity mask. Again, mask layer down here at the bottom. Hold Option. Luminosity mask range. Choose highlights. And now I've only applied that to the highlights up there. You can see a preview. You can see where I'm hitting. Remove that. And let's toggle this layer off and on. And it gives me that warmth up there in those trees. Now, if I thought that was too intense still, I could either adjust white balance here and change it, or I could change the opacity and tweak it that way. And finally, we're just going to add one more white balance. I want to cool the shadows down a little bit. So here we're going to pull the white balance a little cooler, make a big swing. That's around 14%. We are going to put a luminosity range on it. Again, Option, click the mask, luminosity range. This time I'm going to choose shadows. Stick on and off. And there, I like that. It might be a touch strong, so we'll back the opacity down to around 90%. There, I like that. All of these layers can be renamed. Highly recommend that. I should be more organized because otherwise you're going to be wondering what you're doing. But I could come in here and rename this Cool Shadows. Rename this one Warm Highlights. Do this linear gradient I did down there as a water fix. So you can rename them, do anything like you normally can. Okay, so that's most of this image. Let's just do a quick crop. Again, the crop tool's over here, just like it would be in Photoshop, where you can press C. A 4x5 crop works pretty good on this. Move that crop box around a little bit. You can change your ratio up here. You can do a custom ratio where you just type in the aspect ratio you want. You can punch in the size you want. You can do original ratio. You can do unconstrained. So you have several crop options to play with up there. And then just double click. And now I have my 4x5 ratio set up like that. So that's that. Okay, two more things. One, let's play with a sharpening mask here. We're going to come down to what they call a live filter. We'll dive into that a little bit more on a future video, but I'm at the top of the stack. And if I scroll down here, they have an unsharp mask. Toss it on, and it comes in default. It's having no effect. So this was shot on a Nikon Z7 II, which is a 45 megapixel camera, in which case the radius I've been playing with, it seems like right around 3-ish is probably good. I'm still trying to figure out if that's where I want it to be, but for this demo, that's it. And then factors, how much is it being applied? So we're going to turn this up. Let's zoom in. It's always better to watch your sharpening like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring your factor in. This is how much is being applied. I can obviously go way overboard to 4, and that is way too crispy. But you get around 2 or so. That looks pretty good. So let's take this back to normal size. Now this is being applied everywhere, all across. It's a little bit much. So I like to apply this sharpening to sort of the midtones. So we're going to do the same thing as we have been. We're going to come into layer, add a luminosity range mask, and we're going to do midtones. And now I sort of keep the leaves and keep these highlights soft while I sort of sharpen up the rock. So 100%, that's Command 1, let you just jump right in there 100%, and that looks good. And then finally, the last little thing, I like to apply a vignette. And so I'm going to come down here to my base layer. We are going to add a live filter again, scroll down, way down to the vignette. This is going to apply a vignette option. So I'm going to reduce the exposure a little bit on that. And I like to bring the hardness all the way down to essentially almost 0 to get that super nice feathered effect. I'm actually still trying to master the vignette tool here. I'm not sure I like this way of doing it. I've seen some other ways to do it. I'll probably cover vignettes and some of the options to do that in Affinity Photo 2 in the future, but this gets me to a passable result from there. And that's the photo. We've got it cropped, we've got edited, and really just to export, we can come up to File, Export. It has several different options you can do. I'm doing JPEG, I'm doing best quality. I'm just taking the options as they are. Export, drop this into Affinity Demo, save it. Take a look at the final file. And there we go. Like I said, this is a fast edit. I would probably spend a little more time on it, fine tuning it. I'd probably work a little bit more with this water. But essentially, at the end of the day, I think you sort of get the point. Affinity Photo 2 has many of the similar tools as Photoshop and can allow you to do a lot of some pretty impressive things with it. I've really started to get sort of used to it as I've been working with a little more. In fact, several of my most recent social posts have been done all in Affinity Photo 2. I haven't used Lightroom or anything like that. But if you're not doing as much photo editing or you're trying to keep your expenses low and you've got a budget, Affinity Photo 2 looks pretty promising. So I do expect to do some more tutorials on Affinity Photo 2 beyond just this sort of transition from coming from Adobe to this. But like I said, this is something I sort of wish I'd had when I first dove in, of sort of take me from the Adobe mindset of working on a raw file, what I'm doing over here, and how I get it back out of there. So I'm hoping this will be helpful to landscape photographers who are looking to explore Affinity Photo 2. Like I said, 6-month free trial. It's really hard to beat. And that's Affinity Photo 2. Took me a bit to get used to it, but it's a very capable program. I've been pretty impressed with it. Hopefully this video will help you if you consider trialing Affinity Photo 2 during their 6-month free trial or picking it up at their 50% off. And I hope you get up to speed more quickly if you're coming from Adobe products for your landscape photography editing into Affinity Photo 2. And remember, if you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that like button. And if you want to see future landscape photography content from me, including tips, tricks, behind the scenes, more Affinity Photo 2 videos, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future content from me. And thank you for watching.